Let's talk about all of this with my panel tonight. Sarah Krussoff is with us, former federal prosecutor for the Southern District of New York, and Joe Moreno, former U.S. federal prosecutor. Great to see you both. Thanks for joining me tonight. First of all, Sarah, let's start with you. Can you explain to us the judge's reasoning here on why this plea deal collapsed, why she couldn't accept it?
Yeah, from the reporting that's coming out, it sounds like there just wasn't a meeting of the minds between the prosecutors here and the defense team on the scope of this plea. Most particularly, really, the immunity paragraph. Sort of what conduct was covered by these pleas, and so without that agreement, would be very hard for the judge to accept this plea.
Joe, the judge had indicated that she said this was an unusual agreement. Is it an unusual agreement for this type of case?
Well, Sumi, I think what she was pointing to there is the diversion portion of this, which is basically the idea that Hunter Biden on the gun charge could basically get almost a probation where he, as long as he stays out of trouble for some period of time, the charges effectively fall off and never appear on his record. So I think the judge was kind of picking at that and saying that's highly unusual. There may be some constitutional questions about that. And I'd be curious to see what Sarah says about New York. But in Virginia, where I practice, I've never heard of something like that before. And people I've asked about have said the same thing. So it's definitely highly unusual. And so that, coupled with Sarah's point about a lack of the meeting of the minds, made this a spectacular debacle in court today.
Sarah, what does it look like there in New York?
Yeah, so, I mean, it would be very unusual to have something like that here, that diversionary outcome related to the the gun charge. That is highly unusual. I mean, frankly, it is not unusual for a plea deal just sort of not to go forward the first try. That has happened to me as a prosecutor. You see it happen sort of sometimes the parties come into court, they're not quite there into the agreement. But it's surprising to see it in a case like this where you would expect all of those details to have been hashed out beforehand at great length.
Sir, can you help us understand what happens next and whether Hunter Biden could actually face a potential jail time?
So the next step is really for the parties here to negotiate, for the government and the defense to talk, to make sure the agreement is clear, and to clarify in the agreement itself any portions that perhaps weren't clear, weren't written clearly enough for the judge's liking. And so I think they tried to do that during the course of today's proceeding. But, I think that the judge sort of rightly so probably didn't want that process rushed, wanted to make sure that Hunter Biden understood his rights, what he was waiving, what he was gaining by pleading guilty here today. And so she's giving them time to go back and make sure that agreement is as clear as possible.
Right. And Joe, what do you expect the judge to see in a revised deal?
Well, I think, Sumi, I think the parties will get it right the next time. I think they will get into those details that clearly were not worked out when they walked into court this morning. I think the difference, though, is that politically, there's even more eyes on this whole arrangement now. I mean, people were already speculating before they went to court this morning that this was a very lenient deal. Now that we've seen even more of the sort of making the sausage, right? I mean, kind of the inner workings of these arrangements, even if the attorneys can get on the same page, I expect those of us on the outside are going to say, this does not seem like this was a really true execution of the law.
I do want to move to another big legal story that we're all waiting for, and those are the possible indictments of the former president, Donald Trump. One, a federal indictment, and another possibly in the state of Georgia. On the federal side, the special counsel, Jack Smith, we're waiting to see what decision he takes here and how he moves forward. But how strong a case do you think he would have? This is the indictment, of course, that is tied to January 6th, the attack on the Capitol, and also election interference, Joe.
Well, I've been skeptical because I feel like, unlike the Mar-a-Lago case with the classified documents, that case is fairly open and shut, right? That's a strong case against Donald Trump. Bringing charges around January 6th, I've always thought would be difficult because courts generally don't like prosecutors to bring cases like defrauding the United States when there's not a financial component to it, or obstructing Congress. I think those could be difficult. That being said, there's a target letter that's been issued, and so most likely charges are coming. So it will be very interesting to see how that case, as well as the Georgia case, play out in the coming weeks and months.
Sarah, are you skeptical as well?
So I have to agree with Joe here. It's hard to see that this case is as strong as the case that is pending in Florida. But, the Justice Department has taken its time in doing this investigation. It certainly appears at this time that those charges are forthcoming. And so we'll have to sort of see the indictment if it is to come and evaluate it. But, I think that it may be contrasted with the strength of the charges in the Southern District of Florida.
Sarah, how could a candidate like the former president, Donald Trump, potentially field 4 criminal cases, loads of civil cases during an election campaign? I mean, what is the toll here on the former president?
I'm not sure how he's possibly able to do that, frankly. I don't know how he could just address these cases, sort of putting aside the running for office part of this. So addressing those cases, working with his defense team to formulate a defense, really analyzing the discovery in this case with his defense team, that's a full-time job. So I don't know how he's going to simultaneously hit the campaign trail and defend himself in the way that he really needs to.
And Joe, what about all these trial dates in the middle of a campaign?
Sumi, I don't think any of them will happen before the presidential election next November. I just think that there's going to be too much going on, and the judges will be reluctant to force a trial in the midst of a campaign. I think what's interesting, though, is that I've always hoped in the background that perhaps Donald Trump would meet with prosecutors in these cases and say, look, let's make a deal. I will not run for president again if somehow we find a way to drop or minimize these charges. That does not seem like the way we're going. If anything, we're digging deeper into the hole. And Donald Trump, yet politically, seems to be getting stronger and stronger. So it's such a strange time. It's hard to really even exaggerate where we are. But it is an odd thing that's happening right now.
That's a good point there, Joe. And so final question to you, Sarah. As we just heard from Joe, President Trump seems to be getting stronger and stronger. If we look ahead and say that the former president wins the nomination and perhaps becomes president again, what happens? Can he wipe these cases off the board?
So I think there's a real open legal question about whether he could pardon himself. I mean, frankly, his better bet is that another GOP candidate wins the election and he's that newly elected Republican president can pardon him. But I know some folks who are much smarter than me have sort of puzzled out whether the president would be able to pardon himself should he be ultimately convicted. And I think the answer on that is unclear.
All right, really interesting. Sarah Kristoff, Joe Moreno, great to talk to you both. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sumi.
Thank you.
Around the world and across the